everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Our show is brought to you by the U.S. Army Warrior Fitness Team, which provides awareness of Army opportunities while serving. Team members are active duty soldiers that compete in CrossFit and strongman, strongwoman competitions, both nationally and internationally. To learn more, check out the link in our description. On today's episode, we're discussing the off season, or really the lack of it, for games and professional CrossFit athletes. We have a full crew here with us. We have head coach with Underdogs Athletics, Justin Cotler, and then the two men who recently wrote an article on the topic, Brian Friend and Joe Genetin-Pilawa. It's great to have you guys all here. A very important topic now that we're actually in the quote unquote off season. Joe, I want to start with you as somebody who contributed to this piece you and Brian wrote. Kind of set the scene for us. Give us the background of previous seasons and how qualifiers had worked in the past for athletes.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. So in the sanctional seasons, 2018 and 2019, there were so many events. 15 sanctionals in the 2018 season and 27 in the 2019 season. In the 2018 season, they had 14 qualifiers. 14 qualifiers for 15 events. And that turned out to be really unsustainable for the athletes. Moving into the next season, a bunch of the sanctionals banded together to do a couple of international online qualifiers, and 10 more used the CrossFit Open to qualify for their events. So we were left with 18 events that had shared qualifiers, and then 9 that did individual. So they had recognized how difficult it was for athletes, coaches, and others to sustain this system. And I think that's a really interesting program.
Justin, do you remember this time as a coach?
Yeah, I always refer to it as the Wild Wild West. Like it was crazy. And the biggest thing for us at the time was really trying to get it sorted in our minds. You know, like what qualifiers here? What are we doing for this? What are we doing for this? You know, I didn't. The funny thing is that as a coach, and when you talk about, I've always been somebody who's been really interested in giving athletes opportunities to make money. So as far as that was concerned, the sanctional season was cool because you had athletes that were able to kind of say, hey, I'd love to go to this place, this place, this place. And you have the opportunity to make more money. The problem was that there was just no leadership there. That, you know, there was no governance, and ultimately you needed something to kind of rein everything back in. The problem now is during the season, unfortunately, I don't think there are enough opportunities for athletes to make money. The big money events are now outside of the season, other than the CrossFit Games. And so ultimately, as a coach, my concern, you know, is more along the lines of athlete health and athlete longevity. So I look at it where I'm concerned about the fact that now we really don't have an off season. It's you know, the off season is not an off season because now you've got qualifiers and events that roll right into the season, and the season ends, they roll right into these other events. And it worries me for the future of the sport and the future of our athletes and the shelf life of the athletes, et cetera. So, you know, those are things that I worry about. And I think, you know, ultimately we've got to find a better system.
So just to give people an idea of what that looks like, Brian and Joe, you guys really laid it out. Brian, recently we were talking about a couple weeks ago, the season structure, but it was interesting once you put the pen to paper and we saw how little there is for an opportunity of an off season. It really is just during the holidays. Were you surprised when you wrote all of this out?
Yes and no. I mean, Rogue has had a few different iterations of this over the years. They have had qualifiers in the past, and then last season they deviated from that and it was invite only. They've gone back to that hybrid model. Dubai has changed their tune in this regard in a variety of different ways. This year, they've chosen to go back to something that I don't think they've done since 2015, which is that everyone competing there has to qualify.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's to me is a notable change for them. And then
Mm-hmm.
Wadapalooza, which is the biggest in terms of the casting the net wide here, the qualifier is a massive earning opportunity for them, whereas Rogue and Dubai are funded a little bit differently. And it's obviously super critical, but they also have the most lenient invitation process for the elite athletes, which is that they invite every individual games athlete from the previous year, 2022, to their 2023 Wadapalooza this January. So each of those have a little bit of a different model there. And it's kind of, to me, it's kind of strange how different those three models are for the three premier off-season events.
Do you think that there should be the same model for these major off-season competitions?
I don't know that the model necessarily has to be the same. The size of the field is different. It's 20 at Rogue, it's 20 at Dubai, and it's kind of unlimited at Wadapalooza. They really actually make it difficult on themselves by inviting so many people and then also promising spots to a certain number of qualifiers through their online competition. So that from a planning perspective, that's a challenge for them that they've chosen to have to honor the achievements of the games athletes already this year. I do think that there is a pretty straightforward path that just makes sense to me, which, it can be something along the lines of if you, for example, podiumed at Dubai last year, I think that warrants an invite this year. If you place top 10 at the games in any year, I think that should be good enough for an exemption to any off-season competition that you want to participate in, or at least to one of them, and you can get to choose. But
so I think that's a really good point. And sorry, Brian, I didn't want to cut you off. Please finish.
Oh no! Well, the last thing I was going to add in that regard is that these are a lot of the off-season competitions, not just these three. A lot of them are sanctioned CrossFit events, and so there is an opportunity for the CrossFit Games governing body to intercede here and say, as a part of being a sanctioned event, there are some pre-qualifications that athletes can earn into these competitions, and even though it's an off-season or preseason, depending on how you like to label those events, there is some cohesion and some unity that could be included to make what you did during the CrossFit Games season, which I think is what Cotler is referring to, that takes so much time of the athletes here, relevant if you do well enough in the off season.
So without making myself too much of the main character in this conversation, I was a pretty decent junior golfer, and I actually played in college. But there's a PGA example here, like the Professional Golfers Association example, where if you if you perform well in a PGA event, particularly in the majors, you get exemptions to other events, right? And similar individual event, I mean, so if you let's say you place a top 5 in the CrossFit Games, then maybe that should work out to some exemptions for some off-season events. Justin, you and I talked about this a little bit, so I mean, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, but and I can also talk about some other stuff related to that. But yeah, I would like to hear your insight.
Yeah, I like that. I think you could even stretch it to 10, as Brian said before. And I mean, the concern for me though, guys, and the stuff that I've kind of been talking about forever, which I feel like we don't address enough, is ultimately, right. You've got the season that essentially starts in January, if we look at it that way, right? And the way that I say that is because then, according to the CrossFit Games, you've got to be in a specific spot, right? Especially if you're on a team. So to me, that's when the season starts, right? So we've got the season starts. You've got a couple of months ramping up to the Open, and then you've got quarterfinals, and then you've got semifinals, et cetera, right? The problem is that in an 8-month span, for these athletes, they essentially have one money-making event, right? I mean, you call the Open a money-making event. It's not real. There's a couple spots, but you've got one money-making event, which really isn't a money-making event because top prize is $5,000 at semifinals. And then you've got all these other events now that are outside, even Can West, I think, paid $15,000 for first prize.
Mhm.
Like we've got to talk about, beyond just the qualifier process, et cetera. And I know I'm opening up a whole different can of worms here, right? Like, and for me, it's the fact that in season, we got to have an opportunity for athletes to make more money. Can we incorporate some of these bigger events in that, or is there a way, and I don't know what it is, I'm sure there's other people with brains much bigger than mine that can figure this out. But ultimately what concerns me is that athletes feel like, okay, I've got this long season, then I will have to do these other events because I have the opportunity to also make money at these events. Where is the off season? Where is the downtime? Where are you, and not to mention that, but also where in the off season are you able to train to be able to get better and moving into the next season, which as a coach is a huge part of what we do as our value is, hey, this is your off season programming. These are the things we need to work on to get better moving forward. The concern for me is that it's so flooded with everything else in the off season. There's not a great opportunity to train for a long period of time. You've got things that are interrupting that. And then during the season, obviously, you're looking to these specific events, and a lot of them are non-money making events. So it concerns me when I look at that because right now I just don't feel like it's set up in a great fashion long term for these athletes to be professional athletes, right?
So what I would
the
say,
sponsorships are there, but the money making opportunities are not, especially in season, and that worries me.
What I would say, and I hope that I'm not undercutting something that Brian was gonna just say right now because he looked like he was about to talk, but what I would say is there was Brian, on your Instagram post earlier today about this story. There was an exchange that you had with someone, and you suggested that.
Do you remember who it was, Joe? Which one?
No, I don't actually remember who he was engaging with, but Brian suggested that there was a possibility where an athlete could actually not participate in the CrossFit game season and only participate in the off season as a way to make money. Brian, do you want to? I don't want to.
I had talked about that previously on an episode of The Bottom Line. Yeah, and I think that in some regards it might just be a matter of time because what Justin's talking about is very, very real. If you're not able to finish in the top 5 at the games, even training for the entire 8 months that it takes, or competing for the entire 8 months that it takes to get there, the payoff at the end of the season isn't really that impressive. You could recognize as a coach, an athlete, or a training camp that most of the best athletes in the sport are focusing on the CrossFit Games. And if we instead focused on showing up and being ready for either Rogue, Dubai, or Wadapalooza, that the earning potential of placing highly at one of those events, which might be less well attended by the best athletes in the sport, could yield a higher net earning percentage on an annual basis.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think that raises a great point because we used to talk about like, okay, the glory of the games, right? Like that's got to make the CrossFit Games. But well, here's the thing. Are you trying to be a professional athlete, right? Where you make a living as an athlete, or do you just care about getting to the CrossFit Games? Those are two different things. And right now, the way that the sport is set up, it's not extremely conducive to put all your eggs in that basket of the games unless you feel like, I got a great chance of finishing in the top. I mean, realistically, the top 3. I mean, that's a living. You know what I mean? And then as you start to peel back from that, you would have to, with sponsorship, obviously will help. And I think right now, the thing for me that I ultimately would love to get to is the fact that, hey, sponsorship is great, but, earnings are also great. And the opportunity to make a living has to come from competition earnings as well. And there needs to be more opportunities for that. And right now, the off-season events are extremely valuable. Don't get me wrong. I just think the way that it's set up without any off season at all, really, is detrimental long term for these athletes. I really do.
So then, Justin, how do you guide the athletes that you work with when it comes to making these decisions? Like, what is the right decision, especially when you are looking at the longevity of the sport and their bodies?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I think it's a case by case basis. It
Well,
comes down to.
Sorry. Can I add a little a little caveat to that? Brian added a piece to the story that we published today, where he compared Lazar Jukic to Luka Jukic, and Lazar, who performed better this season than Luka, but they both have had to do the similar numbers of online qualifiers and things like that to get into their off-season competitions, and so I would just add that caveat into your thoughts.
And I think that's a good point, because then we're talking about like case by case basis, right? And so I'll meet with my athletes prior to the season. We'll have a kind of a post-season debriefing, and then when we do that, then we have a preseason talk, and that essentially is, okay, what competitions are going to be right for you, and we talk about the reasons why, the pros, the cons, etc. And everyone's going to be a little bit different. But at the end of the day, what comes into play is, right, where is the athlete in their career? How much competition experience do they have? How much games experience? As far as making a living, they have sponsors. Do they have this? Do they have that? Because everything kind of comes into play. But what also comes into play for us is essentially like, we want a period of time where you can have unbroken training, where you can get a good chunk of training so that we can focus on a strength cycle. We can focus on skills. We can focus on this to be able to take your level from here to here, which obviously for your longevity is going to improve your career. So everybody's going to be a case by case basis. But the problem, Lauren, is in a lot of those circumstances, there is not a lot of unbroken training time. If you're not somebody, at the level of a top 5 or top 10 games athlete, everybody else is grinding. They're grinding. If you get a couple of years of that grinding where you're not able to get a lot of great off-season training, and you're also not not capable of getting a lot of downtime, and that's where I start to see the recipe for disaster, as far as injuries, as far as burnout, as far as those types of things, which worry me, for the athlete longevity.
So the way that I see it is, like, if you had a top 20 or a like top 10 bubble athlete at the games, how are they going to get that 1% better during the year if they're also trying to earn money from these off-season competitions? And, whether like their sponsor deal, like if they go to more competitions, pays them more, like how do they balance that?
Brian, you look like you're chomping at the bit. Yeah.
This is the conversation that I did choose to interact with someone on social media with today, who, and basically the premise of her argument was, this competition, this sport is about earned, not given. And you want to compete at a competition, you got to earn it. And it's like, oh, that's what they've done by performing well at the games. It's very, very difficult to do that well at the games. And when you think about that in the context of what Justin was just talking about, we can take an athlete who finishes, let's say 6th, 7th, 8th, whatever, or maybe 9th, 10th, 11th at semifinals, and they don't have to worry about the last chance qualifier. As soon as that semifinal part of their season is over, they can deload for however long they and their coach choose to, a week, 2 weeks, a month, depending on whatever they need. And then they can start focusing on the rest of the season. If you're making the last chance qualifier, this just becomes an extra stressful month with no real opportunity for a training cycle. If you make it from the last chance qualifier to the games, again, you have no opportunity for a real training cycle. If you don't make it in the last chance qualifier, now after a month of weird intermittent training for this online competition that you're probably not going to make it through anyway, then you can start to deload. And either way, these athletes have 1 to 3 months, 2 to 3 months, maybe, to prepare for the qualifiers that could potentially get them into a meaningful offseason competition. But if you look at the games athletes, someone who's finishing, even if they're finishing in the bottom half of the field, if they want to then turn around from the games, which just ask any athlete. It's a very debilitating physical experience at the games. And you might think that you made it through and you did all right. You need a period of time to recover from that. These qualifiers in some cases start 2, 3, 4 weeks later.
28 days or less.
And it's a really irresponsible decision for the games athletes to then try to turn around and do those online qualifiers, because at what point are you resetting and starting a new training regimen that can actually make you better the next time you have a chance to compete in a live competition? And if you're a fan of the sport, that's what you should want to see. So when you tell me that Ricky Garrard and Roman Krennikov have to do the Dubai online qualifier, despite the fact that they were on the podium there last year or in the top 5 there last year, whatever it was, and they podiumed at the CrossFit Games this year, and that qualifier is coming up next week, that's crazy to me. You don't need
it's 1 month and 1 month and 1 day.
You don't need their registration fee for that qualifier. You're way better off just having that name at your competition, and you should want to have that name, that recognizable notoriety name that athletes, sponsors, fans, etc. will rally behind, coming into that competition healthy and fit so they can perform well and put on a good show, which is what everyone wants to see.
Hence the reason why Ricky's not doing Dubai this year.
There you go. And that's a lost opportunity for Dubai, in my opinion.
And I think that there's a lot, we're talking about a lot of great stuff here, but, I've got a good example, like Alex Gazan and I just had our kind of post debrief. She finished 24th at the games. And really, I talked a lot to her about what it is that she wants, right? Like, what do you want as an athlete? And I have this, this talk with athletes sometimes, but generally only with really high level athletes, which is kind of, okay, how good do you want to be? Like, do you want to go all in? Do we want to try to get to the top 10? Or do you feel, like you want more balance? You want to get some sponsors? You feel good finishing like 20th to 30th? You can make a living from getting sponsorship, etc. If you want to go all in, like, we need training. Like, you've got to train. You know what I mean? Like, that's the most important thing to me right now for her at 20, just turning 21 years old. We've got a couple of years now where I think her trajectory is going to go through the roof. But if we train for 3 weeks and then she does a qualifier, and then we train another 4 weeks, she has another qualifier, and we're constantly breaking up. Then she goes to this event and this event and this event. And before you know it, it's the Open. And you haven't had an opportunity to take these 6 months and grind and try to improve on the weaknesses. That it's not necessarily, I always say there's no substitute for experience. Well, in this case, it's not the best thing for her to go and compete at this and this and this and this. What's really important for her, pick one. Let's do that to gain some experience. That's fine. But then let's train. Let's grind. You know what I mean? And so for her, that's what we decided to do. She's probably not going to be doing many off-season competitions, maybe one, but what she really wants to focus on is getting better as an athlete. And luckily for her, coming off the game, she got a little bit more opportunities for sponsorships. So she now is able to kind of be like, okay, I'm going to really focus on training. And I think that that's great. It sucks in some cases because you want to be able to see some of these athletes at competitions. I get it. But it's just trying to figure out, how do we do this? What do we weigh here? What's the most important thing? And how do we fit it into the season to make sure that they're getting what they need? And it's tough right now. It really is.
I would encourage coaches and young athletes, or athletes that are close to making it or have made it but maybe haven't done as well as they wanted at the games, to go back and look at some of those sanctional years. Matt Fraser did 1 and 2 sanctionals. Vellner did 2 and 2. Fikowski did 1 and 2. Toomey did 2 and 3. The best athletes in the sport that are doing it consistently, this is over the course of a long 9-month opportunity to do some of these. They're not doing a million qualifiers and a million events because it's not sustainable for the body. They'll pick 1 or 2. They'll go there. They'll compete. Like Justin said, that it's still valuable no matter how good you are to have those competition touches and get some experience. But when you look, if you go look at the article we wrote today and you look at the lineup of online qualifiers and live events that an athlete like Luka Jukic has done, it is totally unsustainable and irresponsible if your goal is longevity in the sport.
And so, Brian, to your point, the guys that did those events back in the sanctional days, they won every time they went.
Yeah, they're doing very well at those events, of course, but they're not showing up to 5 and 6 different competitions. You do it.
I will say, as a devil's advocate, and I mean, I can give you two examples. Actually, Danny Spiegel and Sarah Sigmund's daughter. Danny Spiegel.
She did 5 in one season.
5 in one season, and actually solidified her place as a professional CrossFit athlete. Sarah Sigmund's daughter went to multiple and won.
She did 7 across those 2 years.
Yeah, and won what, 3 or 4? I don't have that stat in front of me, but won 3
Both
or
of those
4.
athletes have been dealing with injuries since then throughout the rest of their career.
I know.
But
Totally.
there's another thing that can be thrown into the equation if you want to talk about athletes like that, which is in some cases you can compete frequently enough that you can make yourself marketable regardless of your success in the sport. And maybe that's the objective for some of these athletes to do that, or maybe to do that in specific parts of the world. But that goes back to what Justin's been talking about, is like that's a conversation that you're going to have with your coach your team and make a decision. And if that comes at the expense of health and the expense of the opportunity to excel
and longevity.
Now, we've talked about some possible solutions. I want to give you guys an opportunity if there's anything else that you can think of. I know that I just want to pull this up. I thought that it was really interesting that in off-season competition, the Zelos Games, they're actually allowing whoever placed top 500 in quarterfinals this past season, that they qualify for the Zelos Games Elite Division. Is this something that we think is heading it in the correct direction? I mean, this isn't even games athletes that we're talking about, you know?
No, this is a unique event because there is a live component of it, but it's an online competition that's open to the masses. The reason I do like this is because it actually wasn't known ahead of time. A few people responded to this. I reposted it today just to advertise it in case you're in that group and didn't know that you may have already qualified for this competition. They're like, well, this just will encourage cheating in online competitions. And then as a result of that thought process, what it puts more pressure on is the review committee to review that deep into the field of athletes. Because anyone who's been around this sport knows it's very possible for you to have placed top 500 in the open and the quarterfinals and never had a video reviewed at all, which is then like, well, who are we actually inviting to this now? So there's some good with this, of course, but there's also some potential, negative repercussions down the line.
Okay, other than that, any other ideas that could be the solution to games athletes not having this set off season?
Well, I think creating more money-making opportunities in season would change things a little bit, especially for your games athletes. Because to be honest with you, if they were making money, in season, then they probably aren't doing very many out-of-season competitions, which creates an off-season, which then, in my opinion, really, really does benefit longevity, athlete health, your ability to mentally decompress. It fights burnout, all those other things. That being said, I love some of these off-season competitions, but to me, they're more exhibitions. They're an opportunity for fans to be able to see some of the people that they love, et cetera. But I don't necessarily think that that's where the biggest money-making opportunity should come. I will argue that, and I have argued that for a while. We've got to find a way to be able to create some of these money-making opportunities in season to help the athletes have a definitive off season. And we need to stick to that. We need to say, if that's 2 months, then during those 2 months, there's nothing. You know what I mean? And then after that, you want to have some qualifiers, you have your events, fine. But I think coming off the games, it's right now, it's too soon afterwards. And it worries me, because I do want, you want some of these athletes to be around. You don't want to see them for 1 or 2 years and then have them break down. You want them to be around for a period of time. So
Justin or Brian, are joint qualifiers or qualifying out of the, games leaderboard, is that the way to go?
I think it's a potential way to go. This thing that Justin's talking about, the earning potential in the season, is very relevant. And my assumption is that the games team made a decision this year, maybe in conjunction with the sponsor of Noble, to allocate more prize money to more spots at the CrossFit Games instead of increasing the payouts at the semifinals. Maybe this year maybe they couldn't do both in the same year. And maybe it's possible that this year they'll be able to increase that semifinal payout purse, because I thought that in a vacuum, that was one of the least talked about, biggest red flags of this season, that there wasn't an increase in pay for semifinal performance from 2021 to 2022. But when you think about it in the context of the fact that they did offer payouts all the way through the final, last place at the games, I could see where from a financial perspective, maybe they had to choose one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So if they do that this year and the semifinals have a little bit more money available for the athletes, that would, I think, be another step in the right direction. But yes, Joe, to your point, I think that there are very easy opportunities to use the game season as an opportunity to pre-qualify certain groups of athletes for different tiers of competitions. There are other off-season competitions that are also sanctioned by CrossFit, that are also extremely well run, that are also great opportunities to get exposure. I mean, Filthy 150 is back. Madrid's going to have a big competition there this year. There's this competition going on in Italy right now. There are plenty of other ones. And you could have this tiered structure where by making the games, in addition to being guaranteed some money when you get there, you're also guaranteed an opportunity to compete somewhere if you want to in the off season to get those competition touches without having to go through the stress of additional online qualifiers.
There are lots of other professional sports that do exactly that, especially on the individual level.
And you'll still always have people sign up for those online qualifiers because there will be, dozens to hundreds of athletes that feel like they're right there on the brink. And maybe this year wasn't their year, but because their season ended in the middle of May or early June, they've had the entire summer to decompress, to refocus, and to reload and retrain and get ready for these qualifiers.
Yeah.
Okay, Brian and Joe, any other suggestions that we haven't spoken about yet?
I think we've done pretty good.
Okay, Brian, what's your bottom line?
Bottom line is it's a really difficult sport to navigate right now for athletes and coaches. A lot of tough decisions have to be made, and I don't think it's the best. I think there's a better system out there.
Joe, what's your bottom line?
My bottom line is this is not entirely sustainable, and there are models for how we can do it better. And also, I am super happy that Justin Cotler and I are very similar looking on camera.
You want to take your hat off, Joe?
There we go.
Oh, yeah.
We're pretty close. It looks pretty close.
It's pretty close. Absolutely.
Justin, what's your bottom line?
My bottom line is coming from a coach's perspective, and especially for those coaches out there who may be dealing with this for the first time, where they might have had an athlete that got to the games or gotten further in the season. You need to have a very honest conversation with your athlete. And sometimes your athlete who wants to do this and this and this and this and this, it's not the best thing for their career. And you need to really think about creating that path that leads to longevity. So my bottom line is trying to make sure that you take it case by case with your athletes and make the best decisions to try to make sure that you're helping them to have a long career and not just, short-term success.
Justin, Joe, Brian, thank you guys so much for having this conversation. Lots of good suggestions brought up, and we will see what the future of the off season for CrossFitters holds. Thanks, guys.
Lauren, thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.